So I want to try something a little different today. That I want to tell you something that took me, personally, almost 2 decades in practice to fully understand. And even then, I'm not sure I understood it in my head first. I think I understood it in my chest. In a specific, quiet, slightly embarrassing moment sitting across from a couple in my office on a Tuesday afternoon, watching them fight about the dishes, knowing it wasn't about the dishes, and realizing, with a kind of slow horror, that I had done the exact same thing in my own marriage. Twice. Different partner. Same fight. Same. Feeling underneath that I'd spent 20 years helping other people see their patterns. And I had been running one of my own without ever once stopping to name it. That's what I want to talk about today. Not your relationship problems, exactly. Something underneath them. The thing that nobody tells you about love. Not because it's hidden, but because it's so close to us that we've stopped being able to see it. Like a word you've said so many times it stops sounding like a word. I'm telling you this because I think it's easier to hear when you know the person talking hasn't had it figured out either. Here's what I've noticed. After 40-something years of sitting in a room with people who are brave enough to say out loud what isn't working, love doesn't feel the way we think it's supposed to feel. And I don't mean that poetically. I mean that in a very specific, almost mechanical way. I mean that when most people fall in love, real, deep, the kind that matters, there's a moment, sometimes early, sometimes months in, where something in them quietly begins to panic. Not because anything went wrong. Because everything is going right. And that's the thing nobody warns you about. Maybe you know what I'm describing. Maybe it goes something like this. Someone gets close, genuinely close, and instead of feeling safe, you feel exposed. Or maybe you pull back, just slightly, just enough to create a little distance. Not enough that they'd notice. Just enough that you would dot, or maybe it goes the other way. Maybe when someone gets close, you grip tighter. You check in a little more than you mean to. You read the tone of a one-word text like it's a legal document. You rehearse arguments that haven't happened yet. You prepare, quietly, for the moment they decide you're too much dot, or maybe. And this one is the hardest to admit. You fall hardest for the ones who are hardest to reach. The ones who run a little hot and cold. The ones where you never quite know where you stand. And with the ones who are steady, who are actually available, you feel not loved. Bored. Something in you reads safety as absence of feeling. None of that is random. None of it is a personality flaw. None of it is proof that you're bad at this, that it's a pattern. A very old one. And if any of that felt uncomfortable to read, good. Stay with me. Because that discomfort is important. That I want to talk about where this comes from. And I want to be careful here, because this part tends to make people defensive. So let me say this up front, that we're not looking for who to blame. We're looking for where the instruction came from. There's a difference between those two things, and it matters that in the late 1950s, a British psychiatrist named John Bowlby began studying something that sounds almost painfully simple in retrospect. What happens to a child when they're separated from the person they depend on? For survival. Not in dramatic cases of abuse or neglect, in ordinary cases. Children in hospitals. Children sent away to schools. Children whose mothers were emotionally unavailable, not because they were cruel, but because they were young or frightened or simply weren't taught how to show up. What Bowlby found, and what 40 years of replication has confirmed, is that by the time a child is 12 months old, they have already formed what he called a working model of love. A set of unconscious conclusions, not thoughts, conclusions loaded into the nervous system like software, about whether they are worth staying for, whether closeness is safe, whether needing someone leads to comfort or to disappointment. 12 months old. Before language, before memory in any way we'd recognize. Then in 1978, and this is the study I keep coming back to, Mary Ainsworth conducted what became known as the strange situation experiment. She separated young children briefly from their mothers and watched, very carefully, what happened when the mother returned. What she found was this. Some children ran to their mothers, were comforted, and within minutes were back to playing. These children were securely attached. The mother was a safe base they could return to and then leave from again. Other children either clung desperately, almost unable to be soothed, or went bizarrely still, blank, unbothered in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was protection, and the part that stopped the field cold. Those same patterns appeared in the same children, decades later. In their adult romantic relationships. Not sometimes. Consistently. Across cultures. Across generations. The child who went still became the adult who goes emotionally cold precisely when their partner needs them most. Not because they don't care, but because shutting down was the only tool available once. The child who clung became the adult who reads abandonment into a slow reply to a text message. Not because they're irrational, but because their nervous system learned that slow replies meant something was wrong. The child who never knew which version of their parent would walk through the door, warm or distant, present or preoccupied, became the adult who is drawn to people who are unpredictable. Because familiarity reads as love, even when it isn't. Even when it hurts. And I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, my childhood was fine. I wasn't neglected. Nothing dramatic happened. I want to be careful here, because the wound doesn't always come from the dramatic moments. Sometimes it comes from the accumulation of very quiet ones. The time you cried and were told to stop. Not harshly, just impatiently. The time you needed something and felt the room shift uncomfortably around your need. The time you came home bursting with something that felt important, and the person whose response mattered most was already somewhere else in their head. Those moments aren't tragedies, but they're instructions. And the nervous system of a small child records instructions with extraordinary precision. Here's where I want you to just stay with me for 2 more minutes. That's all I'm asking. 2 minutes. Because I want to talk about what this costs. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way of statistics or worst-case scenarios. In the quiet way that I've watched it cost people across 40 years of sitting in a room with them. It's a conversation that never happened. Not because you didn't want to have it, because when you got close to it, something in you redirected, changed the subject, made a joke. I decided this wasn't the right moment. There's never a right moment. It's the relationship that almost worked. The one where, looking back, you can see that the other person was actually available, actually present, actually trying. And something in you read that availability as suspicious, or boring, or too easy to trust that it's the version of yourself that almost let someone fully in and didn't. Not because you chose not to, because the part of you that makes those choices had already made it, before you were conscious enough to overrule it. Bessel van der Kolk, in his foundational research, compiled in The Body Keeps the Score, describes it this way. Not that we remember our early experiences, but that we reenact them. The body doesn't store the past as a memory you can examine. It stores it as a set of reflexes that fire before you've had a chance to think, which means the cost isn't just what you lose. It's what you keep recreating without knowing you're doing it. And perhaps the most painful version of this, the one I've seen most often across my career, isn't the person who keeps choosing the wrong partner. It's the person who found the right one and slowly, quietly, without ever intending to, made it impossible for them to stay. That's not a character flaw, but it is a cost, and it's worth naming. Okay, here's the thing I've spent 40 years trying to find the right words for. Your pattern isn't a character flaw. It isn't evidence that you're broken or damaged or fundamentally incapable of love. It is a rational, intelligent response to an environment that no longer exists. And that distinction changes everything. Not about what happened, but about what's possible now. Think about what the child in that strange situation experiment was doing. Clinging, shutting down, staying perfectly, unnervingly still. Were those pathological responses? No, they were brilliant ones. They were the most adaptive strategies available to someone with no other options. They worked. They preserved the attachment, or protected the self, or both. They were the right answers to the environment that existed at the time. The problem is that the environment changed, and the strategies didn't get the memo. And this is what Mary Main discovered in her work with the adult attachment interview in the 1990s, something that, even now, I find quietly revolutionary. She found that the strongest predictor of secure attachment in children wasn't whether the parents had a happy childhood. It was whether the parents had made sense of their unhappy one. Parents who had done the work of understanding and integrating their own story, even painful ones, even stories of real neglect, could still raise children who felt safe. Actually, let me say that differently, because I think this gets misunderstood. It wasn't about having resolved everything. It wasn't about having no wounds left. It was about being able to hold the story with enough coherence to see it clearly, to look at it and say, this is what happened. This is what I learned from it. And this is how I know that the person in front of me now is not the same as the person who taught me those lessons. That capacity, what Daniel Siegel calls reflective function, is learnable. It is not something you're born with or without. It develops in relationships, through attention, through the repeated practice of noticing, where am I right now? And what is this feeling actually about? Here's the one thing I want you to take from this. One small, real, usable thing. The next time you feel something intense in a relationship, the clench in your chest when they go quiet, the urge to pull back right when things feel closest, the panic that arrives with no obvious cause. Before you do anything else, ask yourself one question. How old does this feeling feel? Not how old you are. How old this feeling is. Because the moment you can notice, even for a second, that you're a 43-year-old adult, reacting from the emotional wiring of a 6-year-old child, something shifts. Just slightly. Just enough. A small gap opens between the trigger and your response. And in that gap, something that wasn't possible before becomes possible. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who rebuilt meaning from the ruins of the worst suffering imaginable, called this the last of human freedoms. The ability to choose one's response in any given set of circumstances. You weren't given that freedom as a child. You couldn't have been. The choices were already being made for you by a nervous system doing its best, but you're being offered it now. I want to come back to something I said at the beginning. I told you about sitting in my office on a Tuesday afternoon, watching a couple fight about dishes, and recognizing my own pattern for the first time. What I didn't tell you is what happened after that session. I sat alone in that room for a long time. Not because I was devastated, because something had finally come into focus, something I had been circling for years without being able to land on it. The reason I kept having the same argument in different rooms with different people was never about them. It was about what I had decided, very early on, was safe to want. It was about the version of love I had learned to recognize, which happened to be the version that kept me slightly on edge, slightly uncertain, slightly working to earn something that should have been freely given. I don't know your specific story. I don't know what your Tuesday afternoon looks like, or what argument you keep having, or which relationship you're currently standing inside of, wondering why it feels so familiar. But I know that this conversation reached you somehow. And in my experience, that doesn't happen by accident. Usually it happens because something in you already knows what this is about, has known for a while, and is ready, just barely, to look at it. You don't have to overhaul everything. You don't have to go back and explain your entire childhood to the person sleeping next to you. You don't have to have a breakthrough by Thursday. You just have to be willing to ask that one question in the difficult moments. How old does this feel right now? Because that question, over time, asked honestly, even when the answer is uncomfortable, is how the pattern begins to loosen. Not disappear. Loosen. Create space. Let something new in. The wound has been writing your story for a very long time. The pen is yours now. The thing nobody tells you about love is that it asks you to become someone you haven't been yet. And that is not a demand. It's an invitation.